Welcome to the debate. Let me start by saying something that, well, it might make a lot of people angry right off the bat. 99% of people are completely broke because they fell for the biggest scam in human history, the hard work myth.
Okay, wow. That is quite the opening.
Right? But, I mean, think about it. Look around on your morning commute today. You look at the exhausted faces of people grinding 40, 50, sometimes 60 hours a week.
Oh, absolutely. Society conditions us from birth with this idea that, putting your head down, saving your pennies, and grinding through honest, grueling labor is the guaranteed path to wealth and security. But let me ask you, are the people breaking their backs, the individuals working 12-hour shifts, juggling 3 jobs, are they the billionaires?
Well, obviously not. And that uncomfortable, undeniable truth brings us directly into the core of our material today, drawing from the Wealth Manual Mindset Mastery.
Exactly. So the central question we have to grapple with today is this. Is wealth genuinely the result of intangible ideas and mindset, as the text claims? Or, does this text's demand for relentless execution just redefine what the term hard work actually means? I'll be taking the position that wealth creation is fundamentally a psychological and intellectual process, where thought literally magnetizes success, completely decoupling wealth from traditional physical labor.
Persistence, highly organized planning, and the psychological endurance to survive temporary defeat constitutes a uniquely grueling form of hard work. It simply cannot be dismissed as just positive thinking.
Fair enough. Let's dive right into what the text essentially frames as the great lie.
Right, the glorification of the physical grind.
Exactly. We glorify it, but there is a brutally honest, almost shocking quote in our source material that just shatters this paradigm. It says, quote, "Wealth, when it comes in huge quantities, is never the result of hard work."
Never? I mean, that's a strong word.
Never. The book says it comes in response to definite demands based on the application of definite principles. Basically, wealth is directly equal to ideas, not sweat. And let me prove it with a story from the year 1900.
The Charles M. Schwab story.
Yes, Schwab, he was 38 years old, and he attended this fancy dinner party with the richest bankers in New York, including the legendary J.P. Morgan. Now, Schwab didn't walk into a steel mill with a shovel that night.
Obviously.
Right, he didn't work a 12-hour shift. He stood up and gave a 90-minute speech.
Where he pitched the massive consolidation of the steel industry.
Exactly. He pitched combining several massive, competing steel companies into one giant, efficient monopoly. And he spoke with such intense passion and absolute belief that J.P. Morgan was completely swept off his feet.
Which is no small feat.
Right. That single 90-minute speech birthed the United States Steel Corporation. Do you know how much that one idea was worth? An estimated $600 million in profit.
Staggering.
For an hour and a half of talking. The mechanism here is clear. Ideas are the very beginning points of all fortunes. Wealth creation begins purely in the form of thought.
Okay, I hear you, but, digging ditches for 50 years obviously isn't the formula for becoming a billionaire. The physical limitations of the human body prevent us from scaling our manual labor to that degree, but I strongly push back on the premise that the creation of U.S. Steel or any massive fortune requires no sweat.
But Schwab practically got something for nothing. He talked for an hour and a half.
Did he, though? I mean, the text establishes an absolute rule throughout its chapters. There is no such thing as something for nothing. That speech wasn't born from thin air, nor was it just a casual conversation.
Well, it was a dinner party.
Yes, but it was backed by what the text calls an absolute obsession and the highly organized coordination of a mastermind. Schwab had to possess a staggering understanding of the steel industry, international markets, and corporate efficiencies just to be in that room, let alone persuade the most ruthless financiers in American history. Think about the text's analysis of Thomas Edison.
Right, the invention of the light bulb.
Yes. Edison experienced 10,000 temporary defeats before perfecting the incandescent light bulb. Try to imagine what 10,000 failures actually looks like on a random Tuesday afternoon.
I'd probably quit at 10.
Analyze and rebuild when the whole world is calling you crazy and your funding is drying up.
That requires a monumental degree of labor. It is a psychological and intellectual endurance test. So the framework here doesn't eliminate hard work, it merely shifts the arena of that hard work from the physical realm to the intellectual and psychological realm.
Okay, you talk about Edison's 10,000 failures, and people listening might think, well, I don't want to fail 10,000 times. Maybe I'll just go get a PhD and skip the failure part.
Right, the classic academic safety net.
Society tells us formal education is the safe shortcut, but the text completely obliterates the education myth too.
It does aggressively challenge the value of rote memorization, yes.
It asserts that general knowledge, no matter how vast, is practically useless for accumulating wealth. I mean, if general knowledge were the engine of wealth, every college professor would be a billionaire.
Which they certainly are not.
Exactly. Instead, the material highlights Henry Ford. The man dropped out of school before the 6th grade.
The libel trial is the perfect illustration of this.
It's incredible. During World War I, a newspaper called Ford an ignorant pacifist. Ford actually sued the paper for labeling him. And in court, the opposing lawyers tried to prove he was uneducated by badgering him with obscure history trivia.
Like asking how many British soldiers fought in the rebellion of 1776?
Right? Ford finally got tired of the stupid questions. He leaned over, pointed his finger, and dropped one of the hardest lines in history. He said he had a row of electric push buttons on his desk, and by pushing the right button, he could summon experts to answer any question he desired.
Yeah.
He asked, why should he clutter his mind with general knowledge when he had men around him to supply it?
It's a brilliant mic drop moment.
Totally. Think of it this way. I view formal education as being forced to memorize an entire encyclopedia from A to Z. But wealth building is entirely different. It's like being the architect of a massive library.
Oh, I like that.
The architect doesn't need to read every single book in the building. They just need to know exactly how the building functions and exactly where to place the specific scholars who hold the knowledge. Ford didn't grind through textbooks. He organized specialized knowledge toward a definite goal.
The architect of a library is an excellent analogy. But let's pause there for a second. A lot of people hear the term mastermind in this text and think it just means hanging out with smart people.
Right. Networking.
Yeah, networking. But how is the text defining it here? Because building that library or maintaining that row of push buttons requires an immense amount of active labor.
Well, the text defines the mastermind as the coordination of knowledge and effort in a spirit of harmony between two or more people for the attainment of a definite purpose.
Right. And acquiring and directing that specialized knowledge through other people is an intensely sophisticated, active process. You don't just stumble into a group of world-class engineers, lawyers, and financiers.
Sure, you have to build the team.
You have to vet them, you have to align their incredibly diverse self-interest with your central vision, and you have to lead them through complex industrial challenges. When the engineers told Ford that casting an 8-cylinder engine block in one piece was physically impossible, he didn't just passively push a button and accept the answer.
No, he told them to keep trying anyway.
He commanded them to stay on the job until they succeeded, enduring months and months of failure. The architect of your library still has to draw the blueprints, secure the funding, manage corrupt or delete contractors, ensure the foundation doesn't collapse. It is a highly active, demanding form of leadership. It is not a passive shortcut around education. It is the creation of a dynamic, living educational ecosystem that requires constant maintenance.
Okay, let me push back on that specific part, because you're focusing heavily on the grueling management of people. But that's not where the process actually begins. It begins with the mechanics of a single idea.
Go on.
And the text posits that ideas operate almost like magic when they are combined with intense desire and imagination.
I mean, magic is a dangerous word when we're talking about economics.
But look at the evidence provided by the enchanted kettle story, the genesis of Coca-Cola. A young drug clerk paid an old country doctor $500, which was his entire life savings, for a brass kettle, a wooden paddle, and a small slip of paper containing a secret formula.
Right.
Now, the doctor had possessed that formula for years, but he hadn't built a global empire. What did the clerk do differently?
He executed.
He applied imagination. The text explicitly states that the clerk mixed that secret formula with an ingredient the doctor knew nothing about: imagination.
Well, sure, but
Let me finish this thought.
He saw the potential of that idea, and through that vision, he built a product that literally defied the Great Depression, generating endless employment and wealth across the globe. The wealth didn't come from the physical brass kettle. It came from the capacity of his mind to conceive of a massive, global demand. The physical execution was entirely secondary to the initial imaginative spark.
I have to completely disagree that execution is secondary. Let me tell you why. The idea of a refreshing beverage is just an idea.
It's the starting line.
Yes, imagination is the starting line, but the slip of paper the clerk bought was at that exact moment just a scrap of paper. The text places massive emphasis on the fact that an idea must be crystallized into a definite plan of action. To illustrate this, let's look at the counterexample of Dr. Frank Gonzalez.
Ah, the young clergyman who wanted to reform the educational system.
Exactly. He calculated that he needed $1 million to build a new institute. Now, he didn't just sit in a room and casually imagine $1 million falling from the sky.
No, of course not.
He didn't just think positive. He made a definite, terrifying decision to get that money within 1 week.
And he crafted a highly specific sermon to get it.
Titled, What I Would Do If I Had $1 Million. He booked the pulpit, he delivered the pitch with immense conviction, and immediately after the sermon, Philip Armour walked up and agreed to fund the Armour Institute of Technology. But let's look at the why here. Why did giving himself a terrifying 36-hour deadline work?
Because it forced his hand?
Precisely. Setting a rigid deadline strips away the brain's ability to procrastinate. It forces the subconscious to immediately crystallize an abstract desire into a practical, actionable plan. The wealth, the $1 million, did not come from the imagination alone. It came from the courage to execute a high-stakes plan within a rigid timeline.
Right, but
if Gonzalez had merely imagined the school, he would have remained a poor clergyman with a nice idea.
You are treating the idea and the execution as two entirely separate forces, when the text suggests they are deeply intertwined through the subconscious mind. And this leads us to the most provocative, perhaps even triggering, claim in our source material: the concept that poverty is essentially a choice.
Oh, that is definitely a controversial framing of the material.
But it's what the text argues. It claims the brain acts as a literal magnet. The universe is filled with a form of power that adapts itself to the nature of our thoughts. Crucially, the subconscious mind makes no distinction between constructive and destructive thought impulses.
Meaning, if you obsess over what you lack, you create more lack.
Exactly. It will translate a thought of poverty into physical reality just as quickly as it will act upon a thought of wealth. If a person constantly complains about being broke, if they obsess over their lack of resources, their brain translates that fear into a physical reality by blinding them to opportunity and paralyzing their initiative.
That is very literal reading.
This is where the concept of autosuggestion comes in. The material suggests that we can play a legitimate trick on our own subconscious by repeatedly emotionally visualizing ourselves in possession of the wealth we desire. We force the subconscious mind to expect and demand that wealth. We magnetize our minds.
But
This isn't just wishing. It is a psychological mechanism that literally attracts the forces, the people, and the circumstances necessary to achieve the goal.
we have to be incredibly careful here to avoid a reductive, magical thinking interpretation. The idea that you can just trick your brain, stand in front of a mirror, visualize a pile of gold, and have it manifest in your living room is a gross misreading of the text's actual mechanics. The subconscious doesn't just hand you money.
How so? It literally says you attract it.
The text is very precise about this. It states that the subconscious mind hands you practical plans to acquire the money. Let's break down the neurology of this for a second. When you use autosuggestion, you are essentially programming your reticular activating system.
Wait, let's pause there. For the listener who hasn't read a neuroscience textbook recently, what exactly is the reticular activating system?
Fair enough. Your reticular activating system, or RAS, is basically your brain's spam filter. At any given second, there are millions of pieces of sensory data around you. Your brain can't process it all, so the RAS filters out what it deems unimportant and only lets in what you've programmed it to care about.
Okay.
Think about when you buy a new red car. Before you bought it, you never noticed them. The moment you buy it, your RAS is programmed to care about red cars, and suddenly you see them on every single street corner. The cars were always there. Your brain just stopped filtering them out.
So when you shift to a wealth mindset, you're literally reprogramming the filter.
Exactly. Suddenly, you start noticing opportunities, efficiencies, and potential alliances that were always there, but you previously ignored them because your baseline programming was set to poverty and survival. But, and this is the crucial part, the individual is still completely on the hook for acting on those plans immediately.
Right.
Think about the text analysis of the Great Depression.
A massive systemic event.
Right. The Depression wasn't just a collective mental event where everyone forgot to think positive. It was a devastating systemic economic collapse. The millions of people who lost everything didn't think themselves into poverty. Systemic structures failed them. However, the text points out that the recovery required new, practical dreamers to step into that changed world and find real, executable economic solutions.
They had to build new industries.
Yes. The subconscious mind might give you the blueprint for a new technology or a new business model, but if you don't pick up the hammer, or in the modern sense, if you don't write the code, organize the capital, and bear the risk, that blueprint remains a fantasy. The mind is the magnet for the plan, but sweat, intellectual and physical, is the engine of the execution.
But don't you see how that fundamentally rewrites the societal script we opened with? The worker on the subway is applying sweat. They are applying massive physical execution, sometimes 60 hours a week.
Yeah.
But because they have not engaged the workshop of the imagination, because they have not defined a specific monetary goal to program their RAS, all of that physical labor is essentially wasted energy in the context of wealth creation.
Wasted energy is a harsh way to put it, but I see your point.
The material argues that we must cross from the side of the river that flows toward poverty to the side that flows toward wealth, and the only oar we have to steer that transition is our state of mind. When you operate from a success consciousness, the universe or the marketplace bends to accommodate your demands. The text points out that the rich get richer in large part because they inherently believe they are rich and successful. Their dominating thoughts reproduce themselves in outward physical action. They don't recognize the word impossible. So while execution is necessary, the execution of a person with a poverty mindset leads to minimum wage, whereas the execution of a person with a wealth mindset leads to the creation of the United States Steel Corporation. The mindset is the ultimate multiplier.
The mindset is a multiplier, yes, but 0 multiplied by 1,000,000 is still 0.
Ouch.
Without the grueling discipline of persistence, the mindset collapses at the very first sign of friction. The text notes that persistence is to the character of man what carbon is to steel. Without it, you are brittle. I go back to the reality of temporary defeat. The material explicitly warns that before success is found, a person is sure to be faced with more than their share of temporary defeat.
Because the initial plans will almost always fail.
They will. And when they do, it is not imagination that keeps you going. It is an ironclad will. The capacity to rebuild a failed business model, to secure new funding after a bankruptcy, to face public ridicule as the Wright brothers did, or to face institutional rejection. This requires a toughness that transcends mere positive visualization. You have to endure the pain of failure, objectively analyze the defect in your plan, and try again.
Yeah.
That cycle of failure and rebuilding is the most exhausting labor a human being can undertake. So when the text says wealth is never the result of hard work, it is strictly critiquing rote, unthinking manual labor. It is demanding an even higher, more rigorous caliber of work.
Well, we need to synthesize these perspectives for the listener. The source material demands a radical paradigm shift from anyone who reads it. We have to recognize that wealth is ultimately born in the workshop of the imagination. Glorifying the physical grind, just pushing through 40 hours of rote labor without an obsessive, directed purpose and a definite plan, is a fast track to nowhere. The text challenges us to realize that general knowledge is merely potential power. True education is the ability to organize specialized knowledge toward a massive goal, and we must actively program our subconscious minds to reject the fear of poverty and to relentlessly expect success.
And to summarize my perspective, while I completely agree that the genesis of all wealth is indeed a thought or an idea,
The actualization of that wealth is far from effortless. Bringing an idea into physical reality requires navigating past thousands of inevitable failures, forming complex human alliances through the mastermind principle, and demonstrating what the text calls everlasting persistence. This continuous cycle of planning, failing, and rebuilding is the ultimate form of rigorous labor.
We certainly find convergence in the reality that the conventional 40-hour grind and the rote memorization taught in traditional school systems are wholly insufficient for accumulating massive wealth.
We do. Where we remain in respectful tension is whether the concepts of autosuggestion and idea generation serve to replace hard work entirely, or whether they merely elevate hard work to a much more demanding intellectual, emotional, and psychological level.
There is vastly more to explore within this material, from the specific mechanics of organizing a mastermind to the intricate ways we can audit our own specialized knowledge. It requires everyone listening to look very closely at their own definitions of labor, value, and mindset.
Precisely. It challenges us to evaluate whether we are merely working hard or working purposefully.
Which brings us back to those exhausted faces on the morning commute. The next time you find yourself stuck in that traffic or standing on that crowded train, you have to ask yourself, are you just pushing a boulder up a hill, or have you finally decided to build a machine to move the mountain?